So welcome to the driver summary workshop. My name is Michael. A lot of people call me Skyfield. This practice is intended to be the very first step before any work is done, moving into planning, taking action, strategizing. And the reason why this is used is because the idea is that if you bring people together and you create the appropriate conditions, there is a possibility to harness a quality of intelligence that is greater than the sum of its parts. It doesn't happen just because people show up in a room together. Sometimes it feels like that. Oh, just get people in a room and collaborate, it'll happen. But I'm sure I see some heads shaking. And so it's very intentionally about designing process where you can access that. So the idea is that, especially when decision making, you're not pitting opinions against each other and seeing, can we get the majority of opinions to vote on this? So everyone comes to the experience, to collaboration with unique experience, perspective. It is by channeling that unique perspective on a situation that we can actually make and evolve better agreements. But you have to have some way to start aligning, so you know you're talking about the same thing. And so there are many ways that one could approach this. The point of driver summaries is that it is intended to be a shared, simple, easy to teach, easy to learn practice. So like if just these 4 questions, it does take practice to get good at getting the scoping right. But it's about everyone having this common way of identifying what is the thing, what is the tension, what's the opportunity. If we think about tension as a valuable piece of information within an organization, a driver summary becomes this package, just a way to package attention and then actually pass it around the organization to where it is needed. And that way, anyone in the organization can become this sensing node and say, it's not your responsibility, but you happen to notice something that another team in your organization, or another organization even, like thinking way bigger picture, needs to know. You can come up with a summary and actually pass this across to some other domain in organization. Say, here, I saw this, it's your domain, you deal with it, but you have this information. And they know what to do with it because they know driver summary. To introduce driver summaries, it's important to think that you know that it comes from an approach called Sociocracy 3.0. A driver summary describes a situation that is motivating action. Another way to think about this is tension, and that's a term that will come up in due course, so I just want you to be thinking about that. And this is description that represents an opportunity to avoid undesired consequences or a worthwhile chance to improve. So as a practice, the 2 things that I think you need to understand about why we do this is it's about efficiently scoping the tension or a situation, or a challenge or an opportunity, and then making the implicit explicit. So this is a collaborative practice. There's little utility in a driver summary if you're working by yourself. It can help to some degree, but I'll show why it's important for collaboration. And it captures the sort of the initial state and the goal state of it's almost like a little theory of change. And how you do this is basically by asking these two questions: what's happening and what's needed. It's deceptively simple. There's actually 4 questions, and I'll go into how this works in a second. But it seems like, oh, I can answer that in a second. But this is actually, it's a skill, it's an art that takes time, especially when you start to do it in multiplayer mode. We're really adapted for this. Like, humans sense tension and navigate tension without even trying. We do it starting as babies, and you do it unconsciously. But if you were to put words to the experience, here are some examples. I feel hungry. What's needed? I should eat something. I feel scared. I need help, etc. It's important to recognize that there's a ton of subjectivity here, right? There's no right response to that. There's so many ways we could respond to a situation. But the sensation, I want you to make sure you recognize that that's important. Like feeling things, it's not just a mental or propositional way of navigating the world. It's like, okay, something's out of place here. I feel it. I may not have the language for it, but trust those feelings. We're evolved for this. So take advantage of it. So doing this as an individual, it's, we can do it unconsciously, we can bring consciousness to it, but it becomes difficult when you need to come up with a shared understanding of what is attention, so that as a group you can actually navigate it together. So a driver summary in this what's happening part, you wanting to describe a situation objectively and then state the effect on the situation. So in the top right here, you can see there's actually 4 questions to make up the driver summary. The first is sort of problem space. The second 2 are the solution space. So what's happening, what's the effect, what's needed, and what's the intended impact of attending to that need. Things to be cautious, and I'll be reminding you as we get into the practice of this, is don't get stuck in the weeds seeking perfection. This is supposed to be it's supposed to speed up your work. And there's never there's never a perfect driver summary, and they're kind of throwaway after a while anyway, or the situation will change and they may evolve. So it's about, is this sufficient to communicate what's happening, to get alignment so that we can move forward together? I mentioned that this is a skill and an art form. What this is really about is if you're looking at a situation, an attention, an opportunity, how do you scope the situation sufficiently so that you are, on one hand, eliminating a whole bunch of noise and extraneous information that is sort of irrelevant to what you're trying to do, but also not narrowing your focus so tightly that you're actually eliminating possibility, creativity, emergence. So it's this sensing the situation. What is the scale? What's the scope? How big do we really need to be thinking about the problem? I can share this in the link later, but this is I mentioned Sociocracy 3.0. Maybe some of you aren't here yet, but this is a practice that comes from, it's a micro practice that comes from that approach. And so I can share the link if you want to learn more about it from the source. So this is the classic example, and this comes from the Sociocracy website, so I don't take credit for this. And it's the kitchen sink. So I'm just going to jump into it. So describe the current situation. The kitchen is in disorder. There are no clean cups. The sink is full of dishes. Notice that this is objective, it's descriptive, and it's contextual. It's not, we're not sort of judging the situation at all at this point. It's just what's going on. Still in the sort of problem space of this is what's the effect of that? So now we're getting into judgment. Now we're starting to see, here's a thing, this is what it's causing. And in this case, it's not possible to quickly grab a coffee and get right back to work. So here, the notes are right there. We're identifying something that's needed. And it could actually, think temporally too. Like, is this something now? Is this something that in a year from now? Like, you're starting to think about how a driver summary can be used. It could be used just in the moment. It could be thinking, planning strategically long term. And this goes back to this practice of getting that scope and scale right. And in this part, in the effect question, you're starting to nail into the problem nail the problem or opportunity. Now we start to move into solution space. And when I say that, I don't mean we're coming up with the answer. And this is not about, one of the biggest sort of warnings and recommendations I can make is beware of front-loading complete solutions into your driver summary. That can get political, right? Especially when you're in collaboration, it's like, here's my idea, here's my pet solution. It can also it can limit your options too. So make sure that you're getting into the area of what's needed without just saying this is the thing we need to do next. There's a little caveat to that, but I'm not going to go there yet. So what's needed? We need the kitchen in a usable state. Why? So in other words, what's the intended impact of attending to that need? So we can stay focused on our work. That language that I just used, the impact of attending to the need. You might notice that there's also a gap there between, so we need the kitchen usable state. It's still vague on what that actually is, right? It's not saying, here's how we're going to organize things. Here are the rules we're going to have around how we keep that organized. And then, but it's getting to the point of what's the desired outcome? Like, what's this all about? What is done look like that we're going to be happy with? I mentioned before about not letting perfection get in the way. This is kind of actually a hint at a subsequent session, which is learning consent process. And I mentioned sociocracy. All the forms of sociocracy at their core, the principle of decision making is around consent as opposed to democracy or as opposed to consensus. So that's just a little teaser. I'm not going to try to teach you that right now. But the threshold for agreement, and this is sort of a heuristic that you can, it's easy to remember, is to ask, is this good enough for now and safe enough to try? So you're covering, this, the safety part, and you're covering like sufficiency. And this is how we fight the need for perfection and getting caught in the weeds. These are skills for navigating complexity. And in complexity, anything we do, there's always going to be unintended consequences. They may be negligible, but there's always going to be something. So we just acknowledge that we're never going to have everything figured out ahead of time. It's impossible. But do we have a sense that this is good enough? This is sufficient. We've covered our bases. This is going to get us to the next iterative step where we'll then have to reorient and then make decisions again about where to go. This is the last one in my presentation, which is where and when to apply this pattern. And maybe you'll recognize some of these points in sort of process. Maybe some of them will be new to you. I'd be interested to hear if anything's coming up for anyone around this.
The image that came to my mind when you were explaining is that we're sort of like all vectors in action, right? And then sometimes we coordinate and we act together constructively, and sometimes we veer off course. When there is a tension, it means that there is a misalignment. And then putting this mechanism in place sounds like the power of pause or the power of creating space so that we can deal with it when it happens and before it sort of translates into a bigger issue later on. So we like micro corrections of the coordination course, sort of, right?
I think this is sort of beguilingly simple, and I'm thinking that the trick to this is in the way that how to get people to align on the detail and the depth of the scope of the questioning. Yeah. So to prevent all the nodes, and I mean individuals, I guess, from, as you say, inserting their pet project answers, solutionizing, all of that stuff, unlearning that are the 4 stages of this driver summary enough to unlearn that best practice of not inserting your pet project or trying by any other means to skew the system to what you want it to achieve?
So 2 things come up for me is let's practice, and that's just, it does take practice. And this is why I believe that learning consent process is a very important next step, because in a lot of the processes that I recommend and that I've learned that you begin with this, the idea is to achieve consent from relevant stakeholders that a driver summary does a good enough and safe enough job of scoping the situation so we can move together in alignment. And that is the other part that takes practice, is this sort of understanding and getting a practice of what good enough and safe enough means, because that is also subjective. This comes back to the whole idea of community of practice, is that we, whoever we ends up being, but let's start with the people here, have this regular space that we can go back to and say, like, okay, we want to cultivate a collaborative culture. As a group, we can sort of figure this out together, and be supportive of each other when the stakes are low.
So one thing that I found really useful about this, especially from mostly from your presentation, Michael, was this idea of watching out for when you're front loading a solution into this kind of problem scoping stage. So I feel like that's something that I even felt myself doing it for this exercise right here. That's something that I find very interesting, and it's something I'm going to be more cognizant of moving forward, is when I'm trying to understand the problem. Am I like inorganically forcing some solution, or am I trying to conform the problem such that a solution that I want to happen is the one that I'm advocating for? I think that was a useful thing for that you pointed out, in my mind.
Chris hit a very good point when he asked about, like, let's also introduce a pause of a sort of a mindfulness. Is this a we problem and not a me problem? Because a lot of the people, instead of focusing on what serves the group, they are very, very preoccupied with their own concerns. So integrated that additional step and pause and consider what this serves or not. I think it would be important, and then we can launch the process. Because maybe if it's a me problem, the person just needs to do some internal processing and figure things out for themselves.
If you ask some like normal like manager from a like normal organization, then it can be like they can be confused, or it can be hard to speak about the stuff that really like concerns them like deep inside. Like it can be, I think it needs some kind of sincerity, and also, yeah, you need to be in contact with your, like, I don't know, not feelings, but maybe feelings as well, but also some kind of, yeah,
Empathy, maybe.
candor, empathy or candor,
Yeah.
both. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing to consider is that we all have patterns. So we have patterns in terms of personality or strength. Our natural impulses based on those patterns will go in one way or the other. And maybe also creating this mindfulness around the fact that people in a group that is diverse will have diverse patterns, and just bring that to the table as well, so that it's remembered. I think people know it, but that in the moment they may not remember.
There's just a couple things that really I wanted to underscore that came up. And so the one, Ramona, you were sharing that Chris had raised this idea about, like, is this my driver or is this our driver? In S3 practice, the very first response after a driver summary has been sort of accepted is this an organizational driver? Or is this our domain's driver? And if not, either if it belongs to another domain, pass it, or if it's not an organizational driver, drop it. And on the front loading, something else to think about is, like, if the response is, if the situation is so clear and the response is so obvious, that's a signal that this is not a complex situation. This is for navigating complexity, right? So there needs to be that sort of tension, that awkwardness, that creative, I don't know.
The one thing it leaves me mindful of is the idea of, and this helps you do that, is leaving space for other people to think and provide a solution without leaping in there. So I think if you do this right, you're framing where the problem is, and even when you're saying what's needed, if you're not leaving space for other people to align or even suggest alternative needs, then perhaps you're being too prescriptive. And that's what I was looking for in terms of how deep to go, in terms of how much to lead. And I think the beauty of what this does is allow people a space, because if you don't leave a space, people aren't interested in tackling the problem. there's no point. There's nothing. There's no impact they can play in it. So that's helped me kind of calibrate a bit.
If you enjoyed this and you think it'd be useful for other people in the ecosystem, spread the word.